Hi. Welcome to week 13, I believe, of Reproducible Research in R. This is a course being taught at LSU online only and releasing one lecture a week on YouTube. So some time has passed since the last lecture was recorded because I actually miscounted the weeks and thought we were ahead in the academic calendar, so that's on me. However, this gives me the opportunity to dive more in detail on certain aspects of R, which I allowed the students to sort of pick. And one of the things that students were interested in, which I was also sort of interested in teaching from a reproducible research standpoint, was handling spatial data in R. And so people, for a while, and this may still be true, they'll learn GIS. So that GIS standing for Geographic Information System, and it'll be separate. So it'll be something like GrassGIS for open source folks or ArcGIS for non-open source folks. A lot of these interfaces are point and click, but they have back ends that allow for non-point and click analysis. And so I think there's like a Python backend for ArcGIS, some of that work. And I think that exists for GrassGIS as well. It's been a while since I've messed with some of that. Because I believe that R can pretty much do everything you need in a GIS system. Today, we'll focus mainly on general spatial data types and how to handle spatial data in R in a pretty simplistic way, but one that is incredibly useful for getting up and running in terms of understanding how spatial data are structured in R, because now we're going to start to use like S4 objects, which we introduced in the first lecture, instead of S3, which is the sort of normal, quote unquote, normal way of handling data in R. And yeah, we'll start to get in some of the complexities of spatial data. This lecture maybe, I think is going to be shorter than others, but I think will still be a sort of nice introduction. So I'll share my screen and then we can go from there. Desktop one, there we go. And so you should see my lecture with string split over here. I don't know why that's there. Something old that I think I was helping students in office hours with, maybe. Not that I don't use string split, I use it all the time. And so the reading for this week is not that reading. So let's just go ahead and delete that. I already have the reading. It'll be updated in the lecture notes, but it's not that. It's something more specific to spatial data and specific to the R environment and to reproducibility. So I should update that. If I remember correctly, I'll share the link to the paper that we're reading down below. And if not, you can go to the GitHub site, which is linked in the description, and all of the lecture materials as PDF, as well as the readings are available there. And so spatial data are really useful because a lot of the data that we work with are inherently spatial, sort of as people in natural sciences. Speaking here largely to the audience of students that I have in the class at LSU, as I'm teaching this from the Department of Biological Science. So I use a lot of spatial data when I do species distribution modeling, which is essentially aimed at trying to find out where species are in a landscape and where they could potentially be, given the environmental conditions or other sort of predictors that are in the model. The spatial data are sort of separate from that and inherently useful and could encompass sort of any things that exist in space. And so here I say discrete spatial objects may refer to sort of continuous data like rivers, which are all of a sudden represented as lines on a map. You can imagine that. Roads in the same sense. Country, town, or research site. And these could exist either as point data or vector data, like we're speaking of early on in the lecture, or as polygon data, which are data that exist in sort of 2 dimensions in space and encompass some sort of area. So they have an implicit area. Yeah, and so a lot of this lecture material was sort of adapted from the work already laid down by, I'd say, like, he's a fantastic spatial data handler and biogeographer, if he considers himself that. I had a chance to meet him one time, but Robert Hyman's, he's at UC Davis, and his sort of book, which is a fantastic resource if you want to sort of take a deeper dive into spatial data analysis, and that's available at this link. And it has raster in the title, but I don't think it inherently relates only to raster data. I think he also goes over vector and sort of polygon data independent of raster data. And we'll get into what that means as sort of this lecture plays out. But basically, just a spoiler alert now, vector data, think of points on a map. Polygon data, think of points encompassing an area. Raster data, think of a lattice, a grid where every element has a value. And so I borrowed a lot from this text and first introduced in the lecture the sort of difference between data types, where I focus on vector data first, where vector data consists of point lines and polygons. And so these are sampling sites on the map. These are rivers or roads on a map, or these are sort of geographic boundaries encompassed by some polygon on a map. But at the end of the day, everything basically boils down to these XY coordinate pairs, which is a helpful way to think about it. So even a raster can be referenced via sort of the classic XY system. And I won't go into it in that much detail, but it's really important in terms of keeping your map projections and everything in order such that these coordinate pairs actually make sense. And that has happened a bunch of times to me, and sort of getting different data sources to line up in their coordinate reference system so that you can interwork them together. Super important, not something that I guess we'll go over in too much detail, but may go over in more detail in the live lecture. And so this just at first introduces the idea of point data that exists in XY dimensions. And so this simple sort of two-dimensional representation of data. And then we start thinking about lines, which are sort of just XY coordinates that are essentially connected in space. And so they're represented by as ordered sets of coordinates. And that's important if you think about it, because if you sort of drew a line between coordinates and the set of coordinates, if you had 5 coordinates, were not ordered, it could consist of going from point A to point E, then back to point B, then to point C, then to point D, or it could actually be in the order that you may want, which is A, B, C, D, E. And so the actual ordered set is actually really important in that case. And this relates to polygons. And so this bit of text I'm not going to read out, but it's available in lecture notes. I want to sort of try to get into the code a little bit faster in this one. But this relates to the idea of polygon because basically it's that same ordered set, but now the set has to consist of a closed line. And so basically where you start is where you end. Like it is an enclosed space in that two-dimensional geographic landscape. Yeah, and that's what this says right here. The geometry is very similar to that of lines, but to close a polygon, the last coordinate pair must coincide with the first pair. So basically, you need to end where you start. And if you don't, then it'll bonk, or it'll just make something ugly that is not a polygon. Yeah, and then it talks a little bit about polygons having holes. We won't really go into that. And so this happens when let's say you want to overlap the geographic range of 2 species, and one species is subsumed by another species' geographic range, and you want to subtract those for some odd reason. You'll inherently, in your resulting polygon, it'll be a donut. So on the outside, you'll have the range, and on the inside, you'll have the hole that you essentially punched out of the range as the polygon for another species. And there's a lot of good sort of, there's a lot of meaningful biology behind why a polygon would have holes. A lot of it deals with sort of niche theory, and it's fantastic. but we also will not really go into that unless people are very, very excited about it in the second lecture. Okay, and so this went over basically vector data, which we say consists of points, lines, and polygons. And now we introduced the idea of raster data. And so these are the two most common spatial data forms that you'll work with in R. And raster data is great for sort of continuous things across geographic space. And it's just as important, if not more important, to mind your coordinate reference system for raster data. So think of things that are continuously distributed, such as annual mean temperature, where it's interpolated across the landscape. And how do you map that? How do you map a continuous surface? And the essentially sort of solution to that is you overlay a lattice, a grid. Think of it as a sort of matrix of n rows and n columns that you lay on top of this continuous surface. And then you simplify all of the sort of continuous data within that surface and say it takes the mean value. And so you can think, like, if you treat it very coarsely, you could have a very coarse representation of those continuous data. And as you start to sort of refine and enhance that resolution, you can have very sort of fine scale data down to less than a sort of kilometer squared, much less for some data types. And so these data are typical of climatic data, as we'll see as we start digging into the code below. And these are incredibly sort of useful, but you can automatically sort of think about how these might interact with point data. And so an example would be from the species distribution modeling literature, where you know point occurrences of a species across some contiguous area, some two-dimensional landscape. And a cat's playing in a paper bag. And you might want to know the annual mean temperature in that, which you have raster data for. And so you need to be able to drill down in those point data and say, that point occurs in this raster cell, and this is the value that we want of mean annual temperature of this raster cell. And I think we have an example of that in the lecture. Yeah, and this is an important bit as well. So vector data is always going to be XY. You'll always be able to extract coordinates given vector data, which is really nice. In raster data, it's just not the case because it's not explicitly stored as coordinates. And that's important both for terms like representation in R, as well as how to get that data out in a form that makes sense. And so I think this is actually directly lifted from the Hyman's text. And so he says, think of rasters as a matrix of spatial data. Or maybe that's mine, because I actually didn't put data there. So I'm going to add it in. So that may actually be my own text. And so now I think we're going to dive into different representations of spatial data in R. And for this, we're already going to start pulling in different libraries. And so spatial data is one of those things where I almost didn't want to touch it because I knew that there were going to be installation issues of packages, and I knew it was going to just sort of laugh at the idea of reproducibility to some extent. And so I think after this lecture and after students start to play around with spatial data, they're going to see the real utility of what we covered last week in the class, which was Docker and containerized environments. Because during lecture, a lot of students sort of expressed the idea of I see the utility, but I don't think I'll ever use it. And so I don't want to teach pedantic reproducible research because that would be silly and not what I'm really going for. And so hopefully this sort of sets up, I guess, more of the motivation or more of the necessity in some cases of extremes, quote unquote, in terms of reproducibility as setting up a containerized build. But who knows? Maybe it won't. And so the three packages that we're going to be using primarily are SP, Raster, and rgdal. And I think we'll start with SP because SP really has everything that you need for point and vector, for vector data, so point, line, polygon. Raster is good for working with raster data. And rgdal comes in when we specifically want to talk about like coordinate reference systems, and we want to get into more plotting, and we want to measure distance between places in certain ways, because spoiler, the Earth is not flat, and it's hard to measure distance when the Earth is not flat. And so rgdal helps some of that bit. It also has some cool functionality for raster manipulation as well, which I think I get into here. And so let's load the packages in. And so we have library SP, and I've already installed them and worked out all of those issues. And so I'm sorry if this is just like, yeah, already more advanced. But feel free to like email me if you're running into problems with this. And I can try to point you to certain things, because rgdal basically requires this gdal backend. And I'm running a Linux machine, and so it has, it says that all the shared files for rgdal are in this user directory. It'll be different on a Windows machine, and hopefully you'll be able to do it just fine. And so we can see our session info, which is always great to check. Just in general, I think putting it at the end of a document is a sort of good sanity check, or just a receipt, essentially, so that other people can see what you're using. And so here are my attached packages where I have rgdal, raster, and SP, the base packages, and then information on what operating system and R version and platform that I'm running it on. All right, so now we can start loading in what are going to be spatial point data, and I think eventually we're going to maybe form some polygon data out of these point data. And so here we have a name of a site, with name being the letters, the capital letters between 1 and 10. And so we can see that there. And then we have our longitude coordinates and our latitude coordinates, which I loaded in there. So I'm highlighting them here. And I think those are all in continental US. I pulled these from another tutorial. So I apologize to the global south for making it US-centric. And then I simulated rainfall dynamics to be autocorrelated with latitude. And so, no, I didn't actually, I'm sorry. I just length of latitude. They're pulled from a random uniform distribution. I pulled however many were in latitude for things around 10 or 11 quantities, and then I multiplied them by 10, just sort of seemingly arbitrarily. And we can see what this data looks like as we form it into a data frame called stations. And so we can look at the head of stations, and it has longitude coordinates, it has latitude coordinates, it has site names, and it has some value for precipitation. And so now we can think about how to actually plot this out. And this is inherently vector data in its structure. It has, each row corresponds to an observation, and each observation has an XY coordinate that exists in coordinate space. Here, coordinate space being defined as latitude and longitude. And so here I'm setting up the PAR, sort of the plotting margins. I don't know why I added this in. This is just my standard, because I think it's pretty and a good treatment of the margin space. And what I'm doing is plotting the points in this space, so plotting longitude and latitude in a two-dimensional space, and then making point size dependent on that precipitation variable that we made up. And so I'll run this top part of the code. And it's over here, hopefully. And it doesn't show anything, and this is why I hate RStudio. Am I doing something silly? Am I? All right, so it's there because it tries to be like Jupyter Notebooks. I don't know. I don't use RStudio that much. And so now we have, all right, we have these spatial data that exists with latitude as y and longitude as our x, which is the way we normally think of latitude and longitude, and points in this space where point size corresponds to our randomly generated precipitation values. And to this, we can add information. So right here, we're adding, we're using text, handing it stations as a data frame, and name as what we want to actually put on the, it hasn't been called, I hate this. Can we do that all at once and have it work? All right, now it works. Now it works too good. So I actually added the polygon as well. So here we're adding the text to each point, where it puts the name of a station at each point. And we're also starting to explore what it would look like to have polygon data. And so here we pull out the first, there we go, the first 3 rows of stations. And we make a polygon with these first 3 rows and the first 2 columns, which correspond to our XY coordinates, our longitude and latitude coordinates. And we fill it in as red. And so we can scroll down and we see now our points have labels. We have sites A, B, and C, which are our first 3 sites based on the station's data frame. And now they are enclosed in a polygon. Super useful in thinking about spatial data for sort of natural science purposes, because polygon data could represent protected areas or a species home range or something like that, or the geographic distribution. And so working with polygon data is probably of interest to many of you, and is pretty awesome. And then it says the plot new hasn't been called yet, so I'm just going to run this entire code chunk, and hopefully we'll make the plot with the line data as well. And so here, I'm representing vector data in another way. So at first I represented it just simply as point data, where we plotted points out and then made them sized by precipitation. Then I added a polygon, which is this triangle between A, B, and C, sites A, B, and C. And now I'm adding line, or a line, in between sites 3 through 6. And so this now assumes ordered data. So before, this doesn't assume ordered data. This says, like, here's 3 points. I'm going to draw a triangle between all 3 points. It doesn't matter if it's point 1, 2, 3, or point 3, 1, 3, 2, 1, or 3, 1, 2. It shouldn't matter. It doesn't matter. It matters when you get more than 3 points, but that's sort of immaterial at this point. And so now when we put lines, we have 3 through 6, and the order matters. And in saying the order matters, I can sort of show the order matters, right? Because we have letters that exist A, B, C, D, they're ordered. And so we can say we started with the 3rd letter of the alphabet on the station's data frame and in the alphabet C. And now our line goes from C to site D to site E to site F. This is not a polygon. This is a simple line consisting of the ordered data that I handed it. And so this is not a pretty map by any means, but it helps you start to think about how SP is, and actually all these are base functions so far. So this is just starting to think about quote unquote spatial data, which really I mean 2-dimensional data, yeah, that correspond to some sort of spatial projection, and that projection here is in longitude and latitude coordinates. And even then, it doesn't really have a true projection, because that will change. Which we actually we'll touch on a little bit, but not too much. So now let's pull out our first package and start playing around with it. And so the package that we want to pull in that I think is a really good workhorse is the SP package. And so basically SP is really good in that it starts to define a bunch of variable classes for working with spatial data. So far, we've mainly been working with S3 objects, which are like lists and matrices and things like that. And now we'll start working with S4 objects, which have slots. And so that'll take a little bit of getting used to. However, all of the base commands will still sort of work on these data, at least the ones that tell you sort of aspects about the data and how to probe them. And so things like structure, or like it's str parentheses, will be really useful to sort of examining and interrogating sort of what these data look like. Some of these Unicode characters slipped in. I'll fix that as I go. Yeah, the classes are really useful. So yeah, read you can read a lot about spatial data, and I hope this lecture won't be sort of subsumed by the SF package, but it may be. So the SF package is basically a sort of reincarnation of thinking about spatial data classes from SP. But I mean, for educational purposes, SP works, and maybe in the future I'll switch over to SF, but it was a little bit confusing for me, just sort of relearning things. And for the sake of introducing you to these different vector data types, I think that they're largely comparable. And sort of the main things that we'll be talking about in terms of class data are these two things: a spatial polygons data frame and a spatial points data frame. And so this is basically an attempt to make spatial data more similar to existing R data structures like the data frame. And so it basically turns it into a data frame. So here we can see that. So we already called in library SP. We'll call it in again just to be sure. And now we're going to create a spatial points object. And so this is something that is manipulated by SP. It turns this into a spatial points class of things. And I'm handing it data on the longitude and latitude of our station data. So we can run that, and we can see type of is S4. And that's something new. We haven't seen that before. We can see the class is of spatial points, which we also haven't seen before because it inherits from the package SP. And then we can also look at the structure. And so this is really useful to sort of start to understand how spatial points and spatial polygon objects are structured. And so that's with this idea of slots, which comes from S4. And so here you see the at symbol and then different levels. And so you can think of these as list elements essentially. And so if I want to access just the coordinate data here, I can see that there's something called chords, and in it is something that appears to be a matrix of longitude and latitude with 2 columns and 10 values. And we can interrogate that by saying points, and then our little at symbol and chords, and that's what we get out. We get out the data that we put into it. Cool, that's good. We can see the B box, which stands for bounding box, and that's basically the minimum and maximum in 2 dimensions that these points take up. And then this is the last thing. And so this is proj4 string, which sets up the CRS, which is the coordinate reference system of the data. And so this becomes really important later on with working with spatial data, especially spatial data that exists globally or spatial data that you pull from disparate sources. And it's a bit of a headache. I'll just be honest with you on that one, because sometimes sort of sources of data won't report this value, and so you're stuck sort of like digging into a bunch of help files on how to actually get at what coordinate reference systems certain data are. And so here we're just treating it as UCM lat long, and I think we set the, So here we actually go about setting the proj4 string, this idea of the coordinate reference system, which I say is discussed in more detail later, and I'm actually not sure if I do. I think I just managed to crash RStudio because RStudio is trash. So let's try to refresh. Is there like a refresh button? View. Let's go actual size. That didn't help. Let's go back. That didn't help. Should I undo? Will undo work? I don't know what's going on. I'm just going to close it. Doesn't close. That's good. Now we're learning. So I'm going to open up my terminal. You see how many Firefox tabs I have open. I have a problem. And I'm going to use htop to actually kill the RStudio because RStudio is trash. So I use F3 to find RStudio, and I use F9 to kill it. It doesn't die because it's awful. And so we use F3 to find our studio again. No, we don't, because we don't have it in our studio correctly. Now we do, we find it, we kill it, it actually dies. And so now I'm going to run the rest of the tutorial from a text editor and command line, because I don't want to deal with that stuff anymore. So let's go up over here. Let's open, nope, it's going to try to open our studio. No, I don't want to deal with it. I thought about giving it another chance, and no, I just refuse. So we're going to pop it out, toss it over to the third workspace, and now we're here, and this is where we are. So hopefully you guys can see this lecture. If not, you can follow along in the PDF. And I apologize, and I'll change the profile here to be larger text. So I'm hopefully pretty sure you can see that. I'm just running R from the terminal. Because yeah, I'm sorry, but RStudio is sort of crapped out on there, and I sort of need that to teach. So tisk RStudio, actually it's probably my fault. So we'll reload those spatial libraries. We're all good. We'll scroll up and reload that station data. Oops, I just did it twice. So now we can see our stations object, which is a data frame of n rows, being n equals 10, has names, blah, blah, blah. We can plot it out. It actually plots in a sort of way better way than in that RStudio workspace. No judgment, some judgment. And now, so we were at this point when it plonked. Or we were a little bit beyond that. So here's what spatial data, when you just type in PTS after converting it to a spatial points data frame looks like. It tells you the class, it tells you the features, it tells you the extent, which is that bounding box. And then it tells you the CRS, which it doesn't know what the CRS is because we never specify the CRS. CRS stands for Coordinate Reference System. But we still have the ability to sort of access different bits of it, right? And so we can access different bits of this S4 object using that @ symbol. And so that's something I'll probably repeat a bunch of times because it's just weird to sort of wrap your head around it first. It's like a list, but instead of accessing it using double brackets or single brackets, we're now using an @ symbol. And we know, like we sort of, or at least I know, sort of when we set up this lat long data frame, that the projection would be lat long, whereas longitude always comes first. So longitude, latitude, and then the actual data structure just follows this really standard one that everyone uses. And I should know the backstory of it, but I don't work with spatial data nearly enough to know the backstory of that. For in-class lecture, I promise I'll learn all about it so that I can like wow you with my knowledge of different coordinate reference systems. I know there's a database online basically that is all these different coordinate reference systems that exist for different locations. Because each location on the globe will essentially have a different sort of datum structure. But this one is relatively standard in my experience. So that's what I got. Let's work with that. So let's actually give it that, this CRS, using the proj4 string, and now we see that the CRS actually has this, this coordinate reference system input. And you can go down a rabbit hole sort of understanding CRS, or you can just read the help file, which is pretty useful. I guess SP, since we're working with SP. And so it's pretty solid. It appears a little bit gibberish here since the line wrapping, but I'll sort of leave that to you to check out and mainly focus on graphing and manipulating these sort of data structures. And so now here what I'm doing, so I now have a points object with the CRS elaborated on. The CRS specifically sort of stated. So now it has sort of knowledgeable coordinates, which I don't know if that would change if we went about plotting it, but we'll plot it soon. But we don't just want points in space. We want them to have some sort of attribute, and that attribute that we want it to have is both a name and this value of precipitation that we gave it. So to do that, we actually set up a spatial points data frame using the spatial points data frame function from SP. So we can specify that it's from package SP using that notation. And then now we're adding in those those final two columns of our original stations data frame. And now we can do that. And so if we type in just the object itself, it tells you what class it is. It tells you how many features it has, with features being points. It tells you the extent bounding box. It tells you the CRS. And then it tells you that all of a sudden, which wasn't here before, that there's, so you can see up here, there's now two variables that are associated with it. Names of these variables are name and precipitation, with it reporting the max and min values of both things. And we can also start to look at the structure of the data frame, which now has only changed a little bit to include this object, which is the actual data, where each, the number of rows match the coordinates value. So here, down here, we still have these chords. The data match the coordinates and provide the covariate data for each of the coordinates in terms of the name of the site and this arbitrarily generated precipitation value. What's also really nice is that we can start to get at the built-in functionality of SP in treating things like base R S3 data frames. And so if I say, if I want to see the top of data, I could use this call, which would say, this is our PTSDF spatial points data frame, and I want to pull out the specific element of this object, and I want to pull out the data object. And I can see, oh, cool, like, yeah, I can do that. That's easy peasy. Or I can also actually just call head on the entire spatial points data frame, and it will output the exact same thing. And so this is just like the internal working of treating spatial data as a data frame. And so a lot of the same functionality that will work on data frames will work on a spatial points or a spatial polygons data frame. Here I add a variable. And so the same, I'm doing this to show the same functionality that would work on a data frame in R will also work on a spatial points data frame. So here I'm adding a column to the data called random, and I'm pulling it from a uniform distribution bounded between 0 and 1, and the number of random draws that I'm taking is equal to the number of rows in the spatial points data frame. So this is not only a sort of like clear demonstration that I can add a column as we would add a column to a data frame, but also that I can use these sort of low-level things like n row on something that is a representation of spatial data, but it still treats it like a data frame, which is sort of really nice in terms of transitioning from working with non-spatial data to working with spatial data. And so now we have our spatial points data frame. Looks exactly the same as it did up there. Here are our variables, but now our variables are 3. They are named name, precip, and random, and they exist in this min and max. They exist in that range. Also, what's important, I guess not important, but like something to note. So when thinking about how to deal with these spatial data structures and how they relate to our more classic understanding of S3 objects in R, is that you can subset them as if you would a data frame. So here I'm defining a spatial points data frame PTSDF2, where I subset the data by those who has the variable random, which I've just created, less than 0.5. And so you'd think that in an infinite sample, there should be around half the data. And so we can then see that. So let's type in PTSDF2, and we have 3 variables and we have 6 features. So it cut out 4 values from this data frame, and we can visualize this. So let's plot out. So now, like when you say plot on a PTS, or when you say plot on a spatial points or spatial polygons data frame, it will just plot, because it knows what's up. And before, like, we had to do a little bit more sort of rigmarole with identifying exactly which columns. Like, don't touch the data, just touch the longitude and latitude. And now it looks a little different, but it's pretty much the same. And these are now these spatial locations with these crosses, I guess, as the points. And so this is the original data frame, and then we can add points of what this subset data frame looked like. And so that means that these 4 values that do not have a blue dot were values who were points that had a value of random greater than 0.5. Okay. Sweet. So now I think we're ready to move into raster data. And so raster data don't exist as points in this sort of 2-dimensional space. They exist as rasters. As essentially, you can think of it as lattices or as matrices. Matrices with specific spatial dimensions in terms of cell height and cell width and what that corresponds to. And so for that, we're going to use the raster package, which is really nice. Really good for working with large data as well, because I think raster has built-in functionality to hold data outside of our memory. And so when working with really like fine scale data, it tends to be a little bit difficult, because if you try to pull in global raster data at a decent resolution, you're going to have something that is equivalent to more than 10 million or so cells of data. And that's starting to get a little chonky. That's starting to get a little bit big. We need to worry about memory. And so here I go through the process of installing raster, but we already loaded it in, so we don't have to worry about that. Let's do it again, just for good measure. And the way we'll think about raster data is slightly different than how we thought about data before. And so we actually use the raster command to just set up a raster. And here, a lot of the commands will sort of inherit or remind you of things from setting up a matrix in R. And so you specify the number of rows, you specify the number of columns. This is one way to do it. We'll go through another way in terms of reading raster data in where you don't have to specify these things in a little bit. But here I specify that I want 100 rows and 100 columns, and I want these to be the min and the maximum values in my X and Y dimensions. And these were chosen basically to correspond to these point data. Spoiler alert, I'm sorry. And then we can say, let's plot these out. And it says there's no values associated with it. And that makes sense. It is an empty raster. Yeah. And so here, it automatically inherits this CRS. I'm not sure why it does that. I guess that's just the default CRS, or maybe it sort of read into the sort of extent that I handed it, and it was like, I know what this is. But either way, this is an important bit. It gives us an idea of the resolution. And so you can sort of resample or downscale resolution, or you can also make resolution coarser. I don't think we'll actually go into that in this lecture. It's a little bit more of a niche thing, although not incredibly so. So I could go into that in lecture as well if people are interested in thinking about subsampling a raster to get different resolution of spatial data. But one thing we can do is start to give some attributes, right? This is an empty raster. Like think of a matrix with just all NAs. That's what this is. And so here, what we're doing is just pulling data from a uniform distribution and then drawing however many cells are in the raster object. So we can say n cell rast, and it should be this value, 10,000, because we have 100 rows and 100 columns. And sense check, that is the case. And now our raster has values. And so now when we say plot and we say rast, it should be some white noise. And it is. So this is what it would look like, where this is 100 values on the X axis So this corresponds to longitude in our example, and then we have 100 values on our y-axis corresponding to latitude. And now we can look at that RAS structure. And before it gave us the CRS and it gave us the extent, and now it actually has some object called values. And we can look at the structure and we see there's a crap ton of structure, and that's good because that helps us a lot with pulling things out and manipulating the data itself. But a lot of the structure is the same as with a spatial points or spatial polygons data frame. And so we see has information on file that's just like metadata, basically. This will become important when you start to pull in data that exists outside of R's memory, where it points to like a shape file, and you deal less with working it directly in memory with R, which we'll give an example of later, so we'll see that. And then it has the same data layer as before, but now it's in a different format. It's in the raster data format. And so in order to actually dive down into the actual true values, we would need to say Rast data, and not just data, but go further and say values. And that should give a vector of 10,000 values. And it does. Because if we just say raster data, it's going to give us all of these different slots that mean something. So it's like in memory, true, that's important, but it's maybe not the most important thing to us when thinking about the data. And so being sort of cognizant of those slots and how to get to them using the @ symbol is important. All right. But otherwise, it's still the same. It still has things like extent. And really, like, the most important bits are like file, data, and extent. Yeah, those are going to be like the ones that you're going to like dive into and dig into the most. Okay, so now the way we set it up, basically, we have this raster, which is continuous data, white noise across the landscape, meaning it's uncorrelated noise. So there's no spatial structure in the values that are pulled there. And so we can plot them as we've done. It should be the same exact plot, so it doesn't change. And we can start to actually add in the spatial points, or the vector data, so the point, line, and polygon data that we made previously in stations, and start to visualize what it would look like on top of these raster data, which we just sort of created ourselves. And so we see that those stations data of 1 through 3, which we can pull out just really quick, so you can see them existing in these longitudes and these latitudes occupy this region of the raster space. And it's interesting to sort of think about what this means, because here you have spatial point data and spatial polygon data, which is continuous in space, right? So if we're zooming in on this line wouldn't correspond to each cell, otherwise it would look jagged. What it's doing is cutting over those cells and saying, here's a polygon overlaid on essentially a lattice of data. And that becomes important when we start to think about issues of resolution and issues of extracting data from this. Because if we think like, what if for that polygon we want to calculate the mean of whatever we call this data, I don't think we actually call it anything, the values of the raster, let's say it's temperature. How do we extract the mean of that when some cells are not really represented and others are completely or wholly represented? And we can also add sort of point data in the structure of lines, and so ordered point data as we did before, and that looks like that. And so just the same as before, but before we just had this as our bounding box, where I'm highlighting it with the cursor here. We really focused in on that area, and now we actually have a better picture of the entire landscape of white noise. And so this is a single value of Z. And so we have XY data consisting of the bounds of the raster, and we have Z, which is that third dimension, that comes out as a heat plot, essentially, which is this color between 0 and 1, which is this random uniform variant that we pulled. But a lot of times when we get raster data, it's not just a single covariate that we're interested in, but it's many covariates, right? Like temperature, you wouldn't just analyze annual mean temperature, you'd want to look at precipitation as well, or how elevation influences this, or slope, or aspect, or predator density. Like there's tons of things that I guess that wouldn't exist as a raster typically, but maybe. But you'd want to analyze more data, especially climatic data. And so we can start thinking about what's called a raster stack. And so imagine this as a stack of pancakes, where each pancake, it's a silly analogy, but it works. Each pancake corresponds to a single raster, and each other pancake on the stack is perfectly aligned with the stack before it, such that if you drill down into one point in the pancake stack, you would have the values of each of the pancake rasters for a given spatial point in the overall geographic space of the pancake. If that analogy didn't fall apart. It's easier to see when we plot it out. And so here what we're doing is we're creating a stack, a raster stack starting with just our rast, which is pictured here, just this lattice. And then we're pulling in things that are related to it. And so what we're doing here is making, don't move that, pulling from a uniform distribution, pulling as many as the number of cells that are in this raster and multiplying it by rast. And so that keeps the actual structure and all the inherits of rast. And so all these slots that are like, here's the CRS and here's the resolution. We don't need to worry about that anymore if we're just adding noise to an existing raster file, which is really nice. So now we're making a stack of four individual rasters, 4 raster pancakes tossed on top of one another. And we can see that it looks like a similar sort of situation to what we had in the spatial points, the spatial polygons data frame, where we have class information, we have the dimensionality, we have all that information, and then we have the names and the minimum and maximum values, and we have 4 layers, layer .1, layer .2, layer .3, and layer .4. And we can plot them, and it will plot them nicely as 4 distinct layers. And here the layer 4 and layer 1 are most similar because layer 4 is just a simple direct not transpose. It's directly related. It's simply multiplied by a constant value of 10. And so here, this is just to show you, this one varies from 0 to 1, and the transformation multiplied by 10 now makes those values which correspond 1 to 1. But now the values correspond from 0 to 10. And these ones just have a bunch of noise mixed in with them. And yeah, I made a quick note of this, and I actually don't think I do anything with it. But treating rasters as raster stacks allows you some functionality to work with them with lapply statements. And so using those previous tools that we've learned to start to work with these sort of new or novel data structures. And I'll try to pull more of those threads to try to get at how you'd actually go about manipulating raster data. What's cool is like the next section's on manipulating raster data. And I think the cool thing is that it has a lot of functionality for subsetting raster data. And so here, this is independent of raster stack. Now we go back to just our single XYZ, our single raster, our short stack, our one pancake. It's not even a short stack, right? No, I don't think so. I should know that. There's one pancake. I think short stack's like 2 or 3 pancakes, which really, who needs more than that? Because that's already too many pancakes, let's be honest. And we can subset these data. And so if we say rast, and we can subset them using the square brackets, like we would normally subset a matrix. And so here, if we say rast 1 through 4 and close the data, that'll be the first 4 entries of n cells, right? And so if we were to, how else do you subset that? Can you do head? Oh, that actually treats it. So using head on a raster treats it like essentially a matrix. And so we can sort of see it if we were to go up to the top. All right, and I'm highlighting those first 4 rows. Sorry, the first 1 row, the first 4 values of that row. And that corresponds to this same thing that we did here, where we called it out as essentially treating raster as a vector of data, where it doesn't go by column, it always goes by row, so it reads by row. But you could also think that you might want to pull out a specific square or rectangular subset of data from somewhere in the raster. And you can do that using the same functionality that you learned in terms of interacting with matrices. So here, this pulls out the rows 1 through 3 and columns 1 through 3. And so it pulls them out by row. And so these 3 values should be the same. So 0.777, 0.934. And we can scroll up and see those are the same values as at least these first 3 values when we took this subset here. And then the values diverge. And so that one's like 0.6516. And all of a sudden, no, we don't have that. And that's because it went down a row. And so this is the start of row 2. But a lot of times you won't want vector data. And like that's a little bit harder to interpret, because now we have a vector of data that it loses its spatial component, really, when we do that. And so in order to keep the sort of structure of that, we say drop equals false, and then it can actually give us an actual raster layer. And so if we plot that out, that should correspond to, instead of this like 100 by 100 cell raster, it will just be a 3 by 3 raster. And that's what it is. Perfect. All right, and so now we're getting to a little bit more where we start to talk about the extent, which we set the extent before. When we initially formed this raster, we said, this is the x min, this is the x max. We set the extent explicitly. And so if we say extent rast, it tells us what we set it as. And this inherits from a class of extent. And that's important because working with the extent function, you're going to do it if you work with spatial data and especially with raster data. But what's nice is that we can actually set the extent. And so let's say like, I no longer want my raster to be bounded in this coordinate system that extends between -150 and -147.9. Is that only it? I guess, I don't know. Oh, that's this, I'm sorry, that's this. -150 and -80. It makes way more sense. And then 20 and 60 in terms of y min and y max, which corresponds to latitude. And what if we want to set it arbitrarily between 1 and 10? Oh, sorry, no, that actually so it still treats the raster as cells and now separates out the extent via the cells that I'm defining. So I'm saying still keep the x min the same, but now only go 10 cells away from that extent and cut it off there. And let's do the same with the y component. And so you see that the maxes are, or I guess that min is the same and that max is the same. But note that the actual extent doesn't change. So you can set the extent or you can sort of look at the extent. And I'm actually curious, can I plot an extent object? I don't think I can. Oh, yeah, I can. Okay, so it's a bounding box. So let's actually plot the extent of rast, and then let's plot the extent of this smaller rast, and hopefully add equals true will work. Yes, perfect. This is making more sense. So here what this did was essentially form as like a weak subsetting down of the actual extent here. But you can still reduce the extent or change the extent without losing the same values. And that's done using the resample function, which I will not go over here. I don't think. I may actually, I'm not sure, I have to go back. But now we may want to like cut out certain areas. Let's say we downloaded all of the spatial data in the world, and we really only want to focus on like a small portion, because that's all we really care about. For that, we can use the crop function. And so here I'm creating a new raster based on an initial raster layer, and I call it crast, but those are the same layer. We can look at the extent of crast, and it's what we saw before, this larger bounding box. And now I can use the functionality from raster where I crop it to a known extent. And so that's when extent becomes a little more useful than just creating some subset of like a leftmost nested thing or whatever, where you have to tell it like what rows and columns you want to keep of a raster. And now here, instead we say like, this is the extent that I actually want. And so now we can see we can see crast, and we can see that it has a different extent than the raster layer before. So if we plot rast, and then maybe we can plot crast and say add equals true, but we wouldn't even see the difference. Maybe it's not a good idea. What if we plotted the extent of crast? Because that should show a bounding box within, and it does. And so here we say, yeah, okay, so the only thing we're limiting from rast and crast is this x dimension. So we can see that by looking at the extent of rast, and it says -150 to -80 and 20 to 60. And then we can see what's the extent of crast, and we see it's -50 to -110 and 20 to 60. 20 to 60 doesn't change. The y doesn't change. It's only the x. And that's represented here with this black line. So this black bounding box going around here is our new crast cropped subset of the data that we care about. And here I think I start to toy with the idea of white space and of merging rasters. And so I make this raster R1 in which I crop the raster object to this given extent, where it exists from -140 to -120 in terms of x min and x max, and 0 to 30 in terms of, excuse me, it's hard talking so much, in terms of y min and y max. Some water. And then we have this R2 object, which has a different extent. It has a -100 to -80 extent. So you can start to see that the y and they start to overlap a little bit, these two raster rectangles. And then a y min of 30 and a y max of 40. And so let's plot these out. Plot R1, there's R1, and you can see the dimensionality exists from 20 to 30, -140 to -20. We can plot R2, it exists from -100 to -80, and 30 to 40, and then we can actually merge them. So we use merge here, which is from raster, and I'll add these in whenever I remember to be good at coding, which I'm not. And now we have a raster layer that if we look at the extent of it, it should be our full extent or close to it. It's the maximum extent of whatever we cropped that raster object to. So between these two extents, it'll be the maximum of those two extents merged together, which is apparent when I plot them out, if that doesn't make any sense. And so here we can plot them out, and you'll see white space. You'll see space where this is a raster that's been cropped from the overall raster, which existed in this dimension, and sort of all across the plot. And now I focused down to just this block and just this block and merged them together using the merge function. That's an incredibly useful thing, especially when you start to have like unknown data, any data caused by like water boundaries or something like that. or just when you have sort of disparate data across a continuous landscape. So before I showed you that a lot of the raster could be subset using our sort of classic knowledge of how we'd subset a matrix, or I guess not a data frame, mainly a matrix. Not that you couldn't subset a data frame in the exact same way using the just single square brackets. And now I'm going to go over a little bit of how to actually go about subsetting a raster using existing raster functionality. So here this says, this is a call called cell from, I'll put the raster there, cell from row col, and here I'm identifying what row and what cell, or sorry, yeah, what row and what columns I would like to pull out of this raster. And so this gives me the actual cell IDs. Cell IDs will correspond to like how we indexed it, where we wanted cell 1 and then 2, and then we read it across the row. Same thing. So 1 to 100 will be that first row of raster data in the full rast object. And this will tell us what the actual identifiers of the cells are. And so this says that if we want the 50th row of the raster, and we want these columns, 35 through 39, this will correspond to cell IDs, or cell numbers, 4935 to 4939. And then we can subset our raster data, those Z values corresponding to our raster, with those cell IDs. And you could use, and so this starts to get into the idea of using extract. And so extract is a really helpful function for dealing with raster data, where you want to pull out the given raster values at a point, an XY point typically. But here, like, we just have this cells value, right, which is just IDs, and we can still use extract for that. And so you'll see that indexing it by square brackets, single square brackets, gives you these values. Indexing it using raster's existing functionality gives you the exact same values. But now we can actually get the XY coordinates that correspond to each of these cells. So now this actually pulls in that spatial component, and instead of giving you these arbitrarily like cell 5000, which is like, what does that mean, where it is spatially? Now it actually tells you, using this XY from cell, it tells you the XY coordinates. It tells you those latitude and longitude centroids of each raster cell, which corresponds to these given bits of these random cells that we came up with. But you could also specify a latitude and longitude data frame independent of these XYs, right? So if I want XY to be a data frame of -127 by 38, that's still within my extent, I can do that. And it'll still pull the data using the extract function here. And so via that method, this gives us those same data. But now it does it via latitude and longitude coordinates, not these arbitrary cell delineations that we pulled previously. All right, so a little bit to go. I think this actually might be taking up the entire time. I didn't think it would take this long to go through, but I think I'm just slow or bad. Plus we crashed our studio for a second, so whatever. So rasters can also exist as spatial polygon data frames. This is an arbitrary example, as sort of many of these are, because manipulating a raster data frame into a spatial polygons data frame will inherently still maintain the lattice-like structure of a raster. And here's like sort of proof of that. So I use as, which is a way to manipulate different classes. And so now I say, I define R, frequency class R1, it's a raster layer, it inherits from the raster package, and now I have R1 SP, and now it inherits from the SP package, and it's a spatial polygons data frame in class. And so previously it looked like this, and now it looks like this. They look similar. And let's like plot them both out and see what happens. Here's like R1, cool. Here's R1SP, gibberish. In a sense, it still actually has all of the same. Is that true? I think yes. It has all of the same characteristics of the other data of R1, but it just doesn't plot as pretty. Even though it contains those z values, the basic plot function doesn't really work with them. But now I'm trying to relate the raster data ideas to the spatial points and spatial polygons data structures. And so now I'm trying to mash some points data. So here we went from a raster data to a spatial polygon data frame data set, and we get this. And it's like, oh, cool. But we can also think about starting to rasterize data, because a lot of things exist as rasters. A lot of things are lattices. And so here we have our points data, which is a spatial points, not even data frame, just spatial points object, and we can rasterize it against our existing rast object. And so this should output something the same extent as our rast object, but now with points filled if they correspond to a spatial point in this data frame. So there should be 10 points. Now, I'm doing this right. There should be 10 points filled in on a raster. Yeah, and there are. And so here it's essentially a raster, but you can't see it. You can't see components of it, right? And so these are squares, and there's a square next to it, but it's an NA. And so it doesn't plot it. But you can see that there's an inherent sort of two-dimensional lattice structure to these data, where previously there were points, and now they have these values that correspond between 0 and 10. Why did it do that? Points. Our values weren't between 0 and 10. Oh, I think it is actually plotting out, not the values. We don't have any values associated with these points. It's plotting out their index. And so this is the first point, and this is the second point, and this is the third point, and I guess this is the fourth point, and that's the fifth. That's dumb, but whatever. You know, what do we do? But we can visualize how this corresponds to spatial points data frame, to spatial points object by plotting the spatial points object on top of this rasterized version of the points object using the points function. And here we see, like, it's not exact, right? Because these points are like the true points. But when we rasterize something, we say, what's like the most, what's the majority of the point in a sense? Or where does the point lie in terms of these arbitrary rectangular or square cell boundaries of a raster object, or raster cell, sorry. And I go into why this jitter is. It's because forcing the raster structure on points influences the relative position of points based on the actual resolution of the raster. And so here we start diving into this sort of thing a little more. I think it's, oh no, we work with external data for a second. And so we can use the raster to points object to get back to the points object, right? And so this is also inherits from raster. And now I'm going to create points 2, where we have points, and then we have points 2. And they should be really similar. But this here just gives us a data frame, I think. Oh no, it's still a spatial points object. And so it's the same as the PT. Oh no. No, it doesn't, sorry. So this is just a matrix or a data frame, where before it was formatted as a spatial points object. But nonetheless, we can plot it the same. And so here, let's plot out the rasterized points. And now on top of that, we can plot the true points. And then on top of that, we can plot the points from the raster that were generated from the original true points and plot them in red. And think about that. Does this make sense? This is because it's taking the centroid of the raster cell as the true point. And that's why you see the differences in space between these red dots and these black open circles. So hopefully that makes sense. If not, like run it through a couple times, and then I think it'll start to make sense, and you'll be like, okay, that helps me understand the difference between spatial points data and raster data and how they sort of interact. And the last thing I want to go over, and I don't think I spend much time doing it, is working with external data. And to do that, we're going to pull in the package rgdal. And rgdal has some cool functionality. It comes with some like base files, which we'll pull it in. You can work with a raster via pulling in an external file. And this is actually from the raster package, but I think it requires rgdal, which is why I pull it in here. And so we can pull in a raster of this rlogo.grid file. And so .grid files are those that exist on a raster. You're also going to run into probably shape files, which are classic. And we can go maybe more into that in the second lecture, sort of working with other spatial data a little bit further. And now we have this F, and it's a raster layer, and it has different bands. It has 3 bands corresponding to R, G, and B. It exists externally, so it's sourced from this place, which is where all my R stuff is. It's in my raster package. It's in a folder called external. And when we plot it, it should look like the raster logo. And we can make it rainbow if that helps. Or if that's more sort of an assault on the eyes. It's very bright. But as much as we sort of read raster data in, we can also write raster data as TIFF files or as other forms of files that can be manipulated further down the sort of pipeline. And so I think this was an excuse basically to get you thinking about reading in data using the raster function instead of setting arbitrary bounds, as well as writing raster objects, like using write raster. And then I go into sort of a slightly less trivial example where I've downloaded the world climate data, which are an open access climate data interpolation, so sort of smoothing across space. So the raster data, for each cell of the raster data, we have information on temperature and precipitation dynamics at that place at some point in time. They're not very well temporally resolved, so ignore the time bit for the most part. And here I'm taking mean annual temperature, and the raster exists. Well, let's see what I'm in my home directory, so I actually might have to change directories in order for this to work. So I'm going to go hop back over here and copy that file, and then back over here, and then we're going to set directory, not to output.tiff, but to this lecture. And so we can say set working directory, and that's the path to it, which I wouldn't put in the homework, right? Because this, remember relative path errors, which some of you have still been running into, because we can't assume that everyone's going to have a Linux operating system in which you have this media structure and a folder named TAD and a flash drive that for some reason is named Euler, and in a teaching folder where I keep all my teaching materials, and then in that a folder called Reproducible Research, which is this class, and then in that a lecture folder, and then within that a folder called W11 Spatial Data, which is a lie because we're not in week 11. It's just time is meaningless during the pandemic. So that was a long way of saying that now we're there. Now we have our lecture.pdf, our output.tiff, and our taverage folder, which contains a bunch of different, a bunch of different TIFF files. And these TIFF files are geotiff files of mean temperature for every month of the year, average temperature for every month of the year. And I'm going to pull out the average temperature of, at 10 minute resolution, which is pretty coarse, for the month of January. Here we go. We can look at the structure of it. It's a raster. And it pulls from here. And so it's not really like clogging up my I don't think it's holding it in memory at all at this point, but I could be wrong on that. But it basically points to this location. And that can cause some issues when working with remote machines, which you may run into in the future. And we can plot this value, and it looks like a raster that we've seen, except a little bit sort of prettier, right? It's better than our logo. Now we have what looks to be actually decently resolved temperature data for the month of January in Celsius across the world. And then we can use our Raster Stack knowledge in a realistic setting, because we have them for all months, right? And so we can actually create a stack of 12 dimensions. I'm sorry, that's messy, but the names correspond to 12 different names of t averages, and then it provides minimum and maximum values for that. And so if we say plot t average, it'll plot out a panel plot of 12 maps which across the globe, which correspond to average temperature per each month. And so we see maybe in this month, I mean, this is sort of the summer where we see more green, more high temps, and then in colder months, you see it slip down and go into no fun land, right? And we can start to extract information on these, given these rasters. And so here we have this raster stack called T average. And let's say we want to extract the average temperature in Baton Rouge using approximate coordinates. I just handed it -91.1 and 30.47, which are like, they're ish, they're close enough. And we can use the extract function. And now we have a vector of length 12 corresponding to, does it look better on their side? No, it doesn't, I'm sorry. It just looks ugly, I apologize for that. Corresponding to the temperature in Celsius, the mean temperature in Celsius for each month in the around the city of Baton Rouge. And so it gets pretty freaking hot in the summer and not too bad in the middle of winter. I don't think it gets that cold. I guess it does though. Whatever. And then we can plot this out as a time series. And so this is just indexing by 1 through 12, or 1 through 12 correspond to the months. And we see in January it's quite cold, and then it heats up, peaks in sort of August, doesn't really slow down in September, and now we're getting into October, and it's starting to go down. But still, nice and warm. I like it. And so hopefully this has sort of ended on a note where it shows you what you can really do with spatial data, both in terms of raster data, external data, as well as extracting points from a raster and then using them in sort of subsequent analysis. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and we can stop the recording. Thank you all for staying with me this far, and I hope you enjoyed this sort of introduction to spatial data in R. Thank you.